Problems we've got in effects is when we're managing scenes procedurally and upstream departments change their results. So that might mean that topology changes, number of objects change, names change, IDs change, and obviously there's no substitute for if the layout department or whoever's upstream of you is managing all that stuff really well. It's really helpful, but it's also really hard to do, especially if you're generating those layouts procedurally as well. So Spatial Blast is a tool that's designed to do a lot more than just blasting. It's really meant to have some kind of informed ability on transferring data from an old version of your scene to a new version of your scene when any number of properties on all those objects might be changing. So you might have positions slightly shift around, you might have the sizes of those objects change, you might have names get jumbled up through error, or you might have IDs on those objects change through error as well. So what Spatial Blast does is it says, based on any input on the right, which might be, say, the old version where you went and you selected some subset of information from a layout, you might say, I want to operate on this for my effects. This is my area of interest. And I'm going to apply all my effects to this stuff, and then in the future that layout might change. So we want some meaningful way of being able to maintain those selections even when things like topology changes. So what Spatial Blast does is it generates some really basic data based on packed objects, and it says the main pieces of information we're interested in for any object are what's its centroid, what's the maximum distance if we unpack it, what's the maximum distance from that centroid to the extremities of the object. So not necessarily the bounding box, but actually what is the furthest point on the object is a more precise measure of its size. So I call that attribute packed radius. The other attribute that I'm interested in is the total surface area of the object. So with those three things, if you were to compare this object and you had exactly the same object on version 2, and if its position didn't change, then the change in position would be 0. If the packed radius became slightly negative, we take the absolute value of that, so we still have some measure of inaccuracy that's always a positive number. So if that packed radius changed a little bit, then we'd say, well, we've got a little bit of error there, so we're a little bit above 0. If the packed radius didn't change at all, it would still remain 0. Same with surface area. It's about the absolute change in surface area. If that surface area doesn't change, we still have a match value of 0. So as that match value increases by summing those three attributes together, we have a measure of how close a match any one object is. And if we're comparing multiple objects in a certain space, then we can order them by that match number, which is basically a measure of how accurately does this new incoming set of geometry match my old incoming set of geometry. And based on that number, the first item in the array is considered the match within tolerances that you can control. So it's possible for us to say, if something's gotten more than 50% larger, I don't want to consider that. If something's gotten more than 1 centimeter away from its previous location, I also don't want to consider that. And so what happens is that if this is my original selection and I'm interested in transferring this information over, then we're measuring those parameters on both inputs, and we're using that to try and figure out a match. So you can see, based on the left input, that might be the updated version of our layout coming in on the left input. And it wants to use this information based on the right input in order to spatially select the information on the left input. So it's actually taking a best guess of what is the most likely object to be a match within these tolerances. And why that's handy is because in certain scenarios, maybe an object's disappeared completely. So you want to use the tolerances, because if an object were to be deleted, you wouldn't want it to just pick up some other object. So to give you an example, actually, before I get into an example, the other thing that we want to do is we don't necessarily want to have to keep this old version of the layout forever just because we're operating on it. So we can cache the important information that we care about in the form of points, which contains all of the information that we talked about that we're using to make our informed guess about what our object matches are. So based on the point position, the packed radius, and the total surface area, we can make an informed guess on the left input for what data we care about. When you do want to go into the mode where you're using points to make selections, we're keeping this unticked. We're not going to compute the packed dimensional data, that data that we talked about, on the node itself. We're going to pre-compute it. So we use a packed dimensional data node to perform that calculation. So here the data is just sticking around for the ride. In this case, we're just keeping the points. So we can use that data to make our selection on the left input again. So what that means in the real world is you only really need to cache these points somewhere on disk. I highly recommend storing it with the HIP file because it is essentially a part of your HIP file. If you lose this point data, you're kind of toast. So you really need to look after it. It's a lot more special than just like some previous version of an asset that might have existed on disk, because it's kind of the same as something like a selection that you'd have in a HIP file. So you should treat it the same. But based on that point data, we're now able to select on the primary input the objects that we meaningfully intended to keep. And because we have this tolerance, we're able to consider, say, a different version of the layout. So let's pretend for a moment that we're now going into a slightly different iteration of this layout, and we've got different objects. Maybe we have like some missing. Maybe we've got some noise on them, and they aren't quite exactly the same. We can shuffle up the point order on them, so they're going to get totally different names. So just to show you, if we look at, say, the name attribute, if we're going to jumble them up so that even the names on the objects are actually going to be different. And so now this is like version 2 of our layout, and everything's gone crazy. So what we can do is we can see how tolerant we can be of making those selections. So we've got our selection from input 2 over here. This was the original data that we had, and now after going through Spatial Blast, that's our best fit based on that original data on the input. So we've got a pretty good match. We can see like there's not really anything missing. There's nothing really missing there, and depending on how extreme the scenario would be, you'd be controlling the tolerance. What difference in radius am I willing to tolerate? What distance in position am I willing to tolerate? And it will try and find the best match in order to do that. You can see that when radius, if you know that the size of the objects doesn't change much, then you can be far more tolerant of the distance changing. So because we're finding the best match, if the best match is like quite far away, but there's no other object that has that size, by increasing the max distance, you can still find a good match to another object that had exactly the same size, but it just moved. So I created this tool to help with destruction workflows, in particular when you've got objects and you really care about when you select all of the say parts of a wall, or you've got a whole bunch of bricks and you want to find out for sure, you want to make sure that you don't lose that stuff. The Spatial Blast workflow is a really good way of transferring those selections, even having some tolerance of topology changes or name changes, ID changes. The other thing to keep in mind is that it's helpful if you can use this workflow by considering that you need a sane rest position to compute the position of. So by the advantage of not having to care about IDs or names is that you should consider how do we make sure that we have a sane rest layout position. So that might mean frame one, even though layout might change, you might try and communicate with the team that you have some frame of that layout where data doesn't change because it helps. Um, Another way of doing it is a sane rest position for things in the layout. But rest position can be tricky because often when objects get duplicated, the rest position doesn't get changed. So two objects in different positions can have the same rest position. So it's not necessarily the best way to fly. But for a lot of scenarios, if the layout, if the camera stays the same and the layout is in a similar position in world space, and you have good communication with the upstream team that doesn't change, that layout doesn't change. Maybe the camera's allowed to change, but the layout does not. Then you can use this tool to pull yourself out of a few more scenarios than you otherwise would when layout does need to change something or animation needs to change something upstream.